Having strong hamstrings is not enough to prevent hamstring injuries. On this week's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, we're explaining why that is and what you need to do in addition to having strong hamstrings. We're going to cue our introduction and we're going to dive right into this conversation. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast, brought to you by Exercise for Life Studios, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset. And the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie.
And today we are discussing this topic of hamstring strength relative to hamstring injuries. Okay, hamstring injuries among people who are relatively active, who are pushing their bodies, not even to an extreme, but just in general, whether it's running or cycling or lifting weights or playing recreational sports, hamstring injuries are actually pretty common. And there's a very good reason why this is, but here's the thing. The remedy that so many people end up trying to do in order to prevent hamstring injuries is not enough to actually prevent them. And that is where we start to have issues with what is commonly being promoted as what needs to be done. And instead, we want to give you what we believe actually needs to be done in order to better help prevent hamstring injuries.
That's right. I think hamstring injuries, just like you said, Charlie, is one of those ones that is just so common, right? Especially if you're active within the gym, and if you're active just like you're generally active. We also see it a lot in athletes where their hamstrings are constantly being overtaxed relative to where their body is, where their body currently is at, and it feels strained, pulled, tight, funky, and so we really have to take a bigger picture look into why is this always happening, and how we approach this type of issue in terms of being muscle specialists and looking at, okay, why is this area being constantly taxed on these relatively strong people? And what it really comes down to is it's more than strengthening the hamstrings, but it kind of starts with strengthening the hamstrings.
Definitely.
A lot of times people are not directly strengthening their hamstrings, and that would be a great place to start.
Absolutely. So before we dive into that, let me just give you a general overview of where the hamstrings are. If you have heard it, but you're not like, a picture isn't popping right into your mind of like, oh yeah, this is the muscle that they're talking about. So if you think about your thigh, it's the muscles that run directly along the back of your thigh. But here's the thing. They don't just run along the back of the thigh. They actually attach up onto the what's called the ischial tuberosity, which is often called like your sits bones. All right, so it's like the bottom area of your pelvis. So up towards the hip, and then it down onto your tibia and onto your fibula. So like your lower leg bones, your shin bone and the bone that runs next to it, it attaches onto those bones as well. So what we're talking about is a muscle that spans the longest bone of your body, your femur. It attaches to areas of your body that are constantly trying to navigate a lot of the forces that we're putting through our body, whether we're walking, whether we're standing, or whether we're being active in terms like our knees, our hips. But it's also influenced by a lot of other areas of our body, including our feet and ankles and our trunk, based on the relative proximity to those areas, as well as just the mechanics of the different muscle influences throughout our body and how those can play a part in the strength and the function of the hamstrings themselves. So that's the area of our body that we're talking about. Again, it's generally kind of along the backside of your thigh, but it also runs up to your pelvis and all the way down to like your shin bone and the bone right next to it called your fibula. All right, so that is the hamstring. But Julie, you made a really great point where like a lot of people actually do need to strengthen their hamstrings. Like a lot of people, hamstrings in a very just kind of traditional way are not very strong. And the reason why I say that is because like when we have people coming in and they will do exercises on our different machines, and not even just like the people that we're working with right now, but throughout my entire career, it's really hard for people when they first start working out to do a lot of weight for exercises that predominantly target their hamstrings. And so unless you are like really focused on trying to build the strength of the hamstrings, for most people, your hamstrings just aren't that strong to begin with. And so because your hamstrings may not be just generally strong enough to tolerate super well all the things that you're trying to do in your life, getting them stronger can be a really great starting place. But if you're already like pretty fit, you're already like active, you're already strong and doing things to strengthen your hamstrings, then trying to make your hamstrings stronger on top of that, you may have kind of already maxed out the opportunity that there is from an injury prevention standpoint simply by trying to strengthen the hamstrings.
That's right. So when we're thinking about the hamstrings, we're thinking about this muscle, just like Charlie said, is living on the back side of our thigh. But it's important to realize that it crosses the back of the hip. So it's a hip muscle. It's not, we can't ever say a muscle is like, a lot of people would think of it like a thigh muscle, right? But we can't call it a thigh muscle because the thigh doesn't move. You have to label it to a joint, right? So it's a hip muscle, it's a knee muscle. And like what Charlie is saying is that we have to start focusing on making sure we're strong in the hamstring. So that means strengthening the hamstring as they function around the hip and as they function around the knee. They're equally hip and knee muscles. So focusing on hip extension, focusing on knee flexion, or hip straightening, I guess the standing up straight motion, and then the knee bending motion. If you have maxed out the hamstring strength, or you're saying, hey, yeah, I already target my hamstrings regularly, which we're saying most people don't, even if you're in the gym, but some people do, there is more to look at in this picture. Reason being is that the hamstring is not a thigh muscle. The hamstring is a hip muscle, and the hamstring is a knee muscle. It's both. So that means that other muscles that influence those areas have a very strong and very direct influence on how the hamstrings are handling things. And what we often find is that when areas are not working well, other areas start to overwork. And that's how we get a lot of injury. For example, hamstring injuries. So when we're thinking about it like this, you have to remember, okay, we're thinking hip, we're thinking knee, and then we're thinking of the areas that have a strong influence over the knee. Because we know the hamstring has direct influence over the hip and the knee, but then we always know there's indirect stuff. And there can be very potent indirect stuff. So the first area that I brought up just now that you also need to be strengthening and really focusing on, especially if you're getting these regular, reoccurring hamstring type injuries, is going to be strengthening the hips. So remember, the hamstring is a hip muscle, but it doesn't mean it's the only hip muscle. Your hip is covered in muscles. You got to be thinking about strengthening the glutes, the adductors, the abductors, the hip flexors. The entire hip needs to be supported because we know that when an area is not getting proper support from muscles, because muscles are the things that create support and strength, then other areas that are potentially working well start overworking or get taxed or get quote-unquote strained or pulled, whatever is the sensation or the injury that you're having in the hamstring. So the first area is going to be that same joint that the hamstring is directly influencing, which is the hip.
Absolutely. So think about it like this. Your hamstrings have the ability to extend your hip, all right? So to kind of bring your leg backwards, all right? Another group of muscles that has that ability is your glutes, all right? So like your glute max, your butt muscle, okay? If your glutes aren't working well enough, but you are requiring your body to continue to extend your hip because you are trying to run or you're trying to jump or you're trying to sprint or you're just trying to pick stuff up off the ground for whatever reason, like you're asking your body to extend your hip, which, I mean, you're walking, like anytime you take a step, you're extending your hip, right? So if you're asking your body to do that, and one of the primary groups of muscles that is supposed to be helping with that is not able to help as much, then other muscles are going to have to work harder. That's what we call compensation, okay? When the hamstrings have to compensate for the glutes, over and over and over again, it can potentially lead to a higher risk for injury for those hamstrings, because those are the ones that are getting overworked. Those are the ones that are getting overstressed. And so strengthening the hamstrings would not help in that scenario. It would just make the thing that's compensating possibly have a better ability to compensate more, but likely because already overtaxed, it may just be breaking it down further. Instead, what you would want to do is get the glute muscles stronger and functioning better, and then that will relieve some of the workload from the hamstrings. Okay, so that's just one example of the hips. We can go through all the different motions of the hip. Again, hip adduction, even hip abduction, hip flexion. You say, well, they extend the hip? How do they also, flex the hip? It's not that they flex the hip, but there are some muscles that flex the hip that also help to bend the knee, that if those muscles aren't working well, it can end up putting more stress and strain on the hamstring. So the body is a very complex integrated system, and so to say, oh well, the injury is right here, so this is the area that needs to be strengthened, is completely oversimplifying. And that's where we're trying to step in right now and say, there's more to consider. So that's the first area, is the hips. Second area is the knees. Okay, so oftentimes we think about the hamstrings as a muscle that bends our knees, okay? And they do, but there are also other muscles that bend your knees, such as like a part of your calf muscles called your gastrocs, okay? Your gastrocs will help to bend your knees. And then your quads on the front side of your leg will help to straighten the knees, but they will also help to fight the bending of the knees, okay? They will also work in concert with the hamstrings as far as spinning the knee in and out. It's called tibial rotation. Spinning the tibia in, spinning the shin bone in, and spinning the shin bone out, okay? And so if the hamstrings are getting overstressed, it could be because the quadriceps are not able to help the hamstrings with the spinning as much. The quadriceps may not be able to control the knee, kind of oppose the hamstrings as much, and it's causing the hamstrings to get stressed. And maybe because the calf muscles are not able to help out the hamstrings as much and are causing the hamstrings to get stressed. In whatever scenario you pick, getting the hamstrings stronger is not helping relieve the workload of the hamstrings. Only by finding the other muscles that aren't doing enough and getting those muscles stronger and functioning better will the stress on the hamstrings get taken down.
That's right. So in the big picture, we want to see that each muscle is doing the job of that muscle. But what we regularly see is that we have compensations in our body. And compensations are less than ideal. They can get us through, but we don't want them there too long, because then that's how it leads to that overtaxing, overstressing thing. So we want to be thinking about strengthening all around the hip. We want to be thinking about strengthening all around the knees. And those ones really make sense, because we're like, yeah, as we talked about, the hamstring is directly a hip muscle and a knee muscle. Another area that has a crazy influence over the knees and thus the hamstrings is the ankles. And ankles are a place that we almost never think about. Ankles and feet, for some reason, we just think, put them in a shoe and they're good to go. If they hurt, get an orthotic or tape it up or something. Or if you're injured in the ankle, then, put it in the air, put some ice on it, whatever. But anyways, the ankles have a lot of muscles that control it. But the thing that you got to know about ankles is that when there is motion issues or strength issues in a joint, usually what we'll see is that the next joint next to the joint with the issue gets overtaxed or has to make up the motion, right? So let's say you're struggling with motion, and that means you're struggling with strength in your ankles. That's going to tax the knees, which then puts a lot of strain and stress on the knee muscles, hamstrings included, because now they're saying, hey, well, this person's still walking here and there, they're still running, they're still getting on their cycle bike, they're still doing all the things they're going to do, and we have to make up the motion because the ankles don't have it, so the knee is going to take it on. Or sometimes we even see it up in the hip as taking on that motion. Either way, having limited strength, specifically in plantar flexors and dorsiflexors of the foot, so it's like pointing the foot down or lifting the toes up, we'll see that start to tax the knee in a big, big way, and thus tax the hamstrings because of weakness and limited motion, because your body is still trying to compensate and work around this weakness that you have. So make sure you're strengthening through your ankles if you are finding that you're having regular hamstring issues or regular hamstring injuries, and specifically working on your plantar flexion, which is like the pointing, maybe doing something like a calf raise, and also your dorsiflexion, which is like lifting the top of your foot up towards your knee.
Absolutely. So what this means is if 15 years ago you rolled your ankle, and even though symptomatically it's better now, if there was any kind of dysfunction created around that ankle, either from a muscle strength or function standpoint or from a mobility of the ankle standpoint, your body's been compensating around that for the last 15 years. And your hamstrings may be part of that compensation process and may now be saying, we've had enough. And getting your hamstring stronger is not going to address the dysfunction that's happening down at the ankle. Likewise, if you've had like plantar fasciitis and all of a sudden you put your feet in stiff and supportive shoes to try to limit the feelings, the sensation, the symptom of the plantar fasciitis, your hamstrings are going to, it may be involved in the compensation process around your feet that are no longer moving as they are designed to move. And after enough reps and enough time of that, your hamstrings may say, no, we're done. We're starting to break down ourselves. And getting your hamstrings stronger is not going to address the fact that your feet are stuck in stiff and supportive shoes. So that is how the feet and ankles relate to the hamstrings. But there's one other area that we brought up very quickly, but also has a big, or can have a big impact over the health and function of the hamstrings, and that's the trunk. And it's not that the muscles of the trunk necessarily connect into the hamstrings or even go low enough to where they are, touching on the same bones as the hamstrings, but because the hamstrings are touching on that ischial tuberosity, all right, that sits bone, and then the sits bone, the ischial tuberosity, is part of your ischium, which is part of your pelvis, and you have a lot of muscles from your trunk that attach onto your ischium, onto your pelvis. Now, all of a sudden, if there's any kind of dysfunction going on within your trunk, which may lead to some like instability around the pelvis, now your hamstrings may be trying harder to compensate for those muscles, holding on for dear life to try to stabilize the pelvis. And over time, they also may say, no, enough. Like we can't hold on for dear life any longer. We're starting to get beat up. We're starting to get broken down, and you end up with a hamstring injury. And no amount of strengthening of the hamstring directly is going to address the fact that there is dysfunction going on within the muscles of your trunk, which then led to the breakdown of the hamstring. So that is a kind of like 10,000 foot overview of all the different considerations that need to come into play when thinking about, wow, you have a hamstring injury. What's going on here? There's a whole bunch of considerations. Fortunately, as you're going through this process of considering all those different areas, the steps to actually kind of work through the different areas are very straightforward. And there's two of them that we have. And regardless of where you're experiencing dysfunction within your body, these are the steps that we recommend. And the first step is you need to increase the function of your muscles with muscle activation techniques. The great thing about the MAT process is not only will it help to improve the function of the muscles, but it will help to identify where the function of the muscles actually needs to be improved. A lot of times people come in with hamstring injuries and the function of their hamstrings is actually really solid. They're just having a symptom in the hamstrings, but it's the function of the muscles of their hip. It's the function of the muscles around the ankles. It's the function of the muscles in their trunk that is causing the symptom and ultimately the hamstrings to get overstressed. And through the MAT process, you're able to very quickly and very easily identify where these specific muscles are. And then once those are identified, improve the function of them from there.
That's right. So the first step is going to be improve your muscle function with muscle activation techniques. It's probably the most potent and effective way to pinpoint like which of these 4 areas that we just talked about really needs to be addressed. I guess we actually talked about 5 because you could have weak hamstrings. So
yeah,
remember,
true.
We kind of talked about hips, knees, ankles, the trunk, and then we also, in the beginning, we talked about actually strengthening the hamstrings. But MAT will find where are muscles lacking that are causing compensations. And remember, injury is almost always a result of a compensation, of something that's out of balance or working too hard, however it makes sense to you. But in the MAT process, we're able to pinpoint very specifically what areas are lagging behind and which areas need to get more on board. And what we find after MAT sessions is that more and more muscles are doing their appropriate job. And so the workload on your body is dispersed appropriately. And so then muscles are doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing versus, for example, the hamstring taking up the slack for 1,000 other muscles that aren't doing their job. Not 1,000, but you know what I'm saying. Many, many muscles, and the hamstring area might be getting overtaxed. It's causing it to get strained.
551.
551 muscles are being
all but
taxed
the one division of the hamstring.
On the hamstring, that's right. So the second thing that you need to do that probably you're more familiar with, if you especially if you're new to this podcast, is to be strength training these certain areas: the hamstring, the hips, the knees, the ankles, and the core. Specifically, we want you to be strength training with the Exercise for Life principles. So these are our 4 principles to maximize strength changes and minimize injury and overtaxing the body, so that you're pushing your body in the most positive direction that you can each and every workout. So you want to be regularly challenging all of these areas to make sure that the tolerance level is high in these areas, so that when you go and do your stuff that you're going to do, workout, sports, play with your grandkids, whatever it is, you're not the strength and the resiliency of each of these muscle areas is higher.
Absolutely. And this is really important as a second step, kind of following up from MAT. And reason being is because if you jump right to the strength training and you try to just kind of build the strength of muscles that are already dysfunctional, what we find is you end up creating greater compensations throughout your body. Outside looking in, it may look like, oh, your strength numbers are going up, or oh, your coordination is improving, your balance is improving, everything like that. But internally, your body's just getting better at compensating, and what it's doing is continuing to strengthen the muscles that are already strong and working well, when these dysfunctional muscles aren't getting strengthened at all. With MAT, we're able to bring those dysfunctional muscles back on board. So when you go and do step 2, which is doing the traditional strength training, again, utilizing the 4 Exercise for Life principles, now they become viable options for you when you go and do your exercise, and you can actually build the strength of those specific muscles that were causing the issue in the first place, instead of just furthering the compensation. So if you want to learn more about the 4 Exercise for Life principles and how to integrate them within every single one of your workouts, that's exactly what we teach you to do within the Exercise for Life membership. You can get access to the entire membership, including all the programs, videos, everything like that, completely for free for the next 30 days by going to www.exerciseforlifestudios.com. And if you're in the Chicagoland area or are willing to travel to the Chicagoland area and would like to get on our schedule for muscle activation techniques, you can book yourself online for your initial consultation and assessment by going to www.matschaumburg.com. There's a big green button that says Get Started. You click that, you can see our availability, and you can get yourself in to figure out where you have muscles within your system that are not working as well as they should, causing your hamstrings to have to overwork and potentially leading to the injuries, the strains, the stress in that area that you're experiencing. Again, the website for that is www.matschaumburg.com. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that has been battling chronic hamstring injuries for the last year, the last 5 years, the last decade of trying to exercise and just live their life? Share this episode with them so they can understand why just trying to get their hamstrings stronger is not enough to prevent hamstring injuries overall. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to us and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find our podcast when they're looking for information on exercise and when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us a 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.